Hello, my fellow listeners and lovers of knowledge. Welcome to the Open Sea Odyssey podcast. My name is Josiah Vogel, and as usual, I am joined by my co-host, Kylan Bain. In today's episode, we will be looking at cultural tensions and the issues surrounding them. We deal with the concept of false narratives, confirmation bias, beliefs, a desire for freedom without structure, and how freedom can be found within structure. Though we cover many different methods of looking at these topics, the two primary lenses of analysis were Jonathan Haidt's Moral Foundations and Kwame Anthony Appiah's The Lies That Bind. As usual, we will also be looking at these topics through the lenses of psychology and philosophy more broadly. So, without any further ado, welcome to our discussion on the Open Sea Odyssey podcast.
What I've really loved about getting tattoos is that you always hear people say, make sure you get something that's meaningful. And I agree with that sentiment, but I think that meaning encodes itself as you live with the tattoo. Because it's not just like, okay, this is what it means, I have it, we're done. Like all the tattoos I have, they seem to grow with me, which I think is fun.
Yeah, it's kind of like poetry. People say, well, if you write a song, write something meaningful. Same idea. It's like, yes, but some of the lyrics I've written now hold more to it than they did before because of everything that's continued to happen since then.
And maybe that's like a intuition and foresight all in one. You write something that doesn't really make sense right now, and it unfolds itself as you walk through life. I think part of it's the creation, but also part of it's the continually new interpretation of the thing that you're experiencing.
Yeah. Because
when you write something, it in itself embodies all of that meaning that potentially and actual. But it's only until that meaning is actualized through a perceiver that it realizes itself.
Yeah, well, it's like for my lyrics, I can tell you when I first wrote them what they were generally for. But now, due to how much I've expanded in what I know, that gets added to that general concept.
And well, I guess the question is then, was the original lyric, did the meaning that you now have for that lyric, was it in that lyric when you first wrote it?
Probably a general view of it, yeah. Yeah, like I have one song called Throne of Deceit, and it's kind of like, it's meant to be visually medieval. And this idea of looking to walls, the castle outside where I'm sitting out in the town, just looking at a castle, being like, yeah, I'm going to give my life to that guy and go out and do these things in his name to unite and bring prosperity and peace. But then realize over time that the very thing that I see as a problem is really this. It's Frank Herbert's Dune. This is kind of the whole concept of the album is beware of charismatic leaders. But the more I learn about that type of stuff, that gets ingrained in that general concept of, okay, well, how many people are willing to just follow someone as if they can do no wrong, and then realize by the end of their life that so much of it has just been a waste.
Yeah, and on and off topic, you were talking about Dune being about charismatic leaders. I was just listening to something that was talking about the trickster archetype. And I think that's the double-edged sword of the charismatic trickster, is that it pulls and it tricks people into truth in ways that are obtuse and absurd. Yet, there can be side effects to there being a charismatic leader holding the power. I think the charismatic quality is good when there needs to be reform and continual change, but when the power is substantiated in something concrete, then I think there can be those problems.
Yeah, I would agree with that. No, it's interesting. I don't know if I watched it before our last get together or not, but there's this really interesting YouTuber named Ryan Chapman, and he does any topics that are of interest to him, and then he does a bunch of deep dive research and then compiles it into a video. And one of them was why we're stuck in the situation we are with our candidates for U.S. presidents. And the conclusion, it's way more detailed than this, but to paraphrase, the conclusion is that it's just we've made the role so undesirable that those who really shouldn't have the role are the only ones that are willing to run for the role, because no one else wants it because it's so undesirable.
Yeah.
I would take his analysis and extend that further to all forms of politics, where it's just like, well, all of it is so undesirable that no one wants to really get into it except for those who really probably shouldn't be.
Which I think is a bastardization of the positive principle of having a leader who doesn't want to be a leader, who doesn't aspire for the power that comes with leading, but has the means and skills to do it.
Yeah. Well, and his argument was, for instance, that George Washington, his whole role of why he was elected was to try and fill out and define the role of what does a president do.
Right.
And then, for instance, Lincoln's whole role was to deal with slavery. But then when he started the Civil War, wanting to maintain the Union, he was also voted in again to not only solve the issue of slavery and equality between men, but also to bring the nation as a whole back into a union. And then you get up to FDR, and he was voted in originally to solve the issue of the Great Depression. But then World War II happened, so he was voted in to solve both the issue of the Great Depression and World War II. But after that, when term limits were created, it became this game where, well, there's way more to it. So you started running into an issue where candidates, even though they didn't get popular vote for a primary candidate, they would still have to campaign to the people what it was that they were going to do, and then the party, being the Republican Party or Democratic Party, would then pick their primary candidate for people to vote on. Well, what started happening after FDR is many of the candidates that were being selected never went out and campaigned because they knew they didn't have to. So as a way of a means to fix that, they made it to where they had to go out and campaign by making it to where every voter of who was registered Democrat or Republican would have the ability to choose their primary candidate.
Interesting.
And that is why we are in the situation we're in. The problem with that is no longer are candidates actually looking at bread and butter issues, as the phrase goes. Instead, they are promising things that they know can't be fulfilled because that will get the majority in their favor, whereas the party would actually want more specifics. So yeah, it creates more of a propaganda train of candidates who are just characters and personalities to our conversations before, instead of actually someone who's there to actually solve a problem. I mean, for instance, I think a great example right now is immigration. It's an issue. But if you look at both sides of the voting, all of them will agree that it's not whether or not people are being allowed freely in here, although that is a problem, or kicking everybody out, which is also a problem. That is the main problem. The main problem is reforming immigration for people to be able to get into the country in a way that's not so ridiculous like many other countries have figured out. But if you look at from Obama to now, it either seems to be let as many people in as possible without reforming immigration process, or kicking everybody out without addressing and reforming immigration process. So the thing that people really want is not being done because it's not a performance of display to the same degree that kicking everybody out or letting everybody in would be. Because, for instance, I was having a conversation with someone about this. It cracks me up. I was having two conversations. One was with a member of my band. Both of us like philosophy and deep conversations as well. And he was pointing out how many of the things that people on the right side of the horseshoe, so right of liberalism, tend to think about the left side of the horseshoe, which would be progressive liberalism to socialist. Most of the narratives of what they hear about each other are not true.
Right.
And when you look at the states, there are 2 states that believe in this idea of complete open borders. That is California and New York.
Yeah.
The 2 states that are completely for kicking them all out, for the most part, is Texas and Florida.
Yeah.
So 2 states out of 50, to do the mathematics here, the arithmetic, is 4% of the country. 4% of the country is dominating how we think about issues. And it's all performative.
Well, and it's interesting to me too, when you said that, the first thing that I went to was the geography of those states, which is fascinating to me. When you look at those 2 states that are, granted, California also has some play in the southern border, but at a larger scale, you have east and west not really involved with any geographic border, and then you have both southern states that are very much involved with the border of on the south.
Correct.
And so I think that's just an interesting phenomenon, and I don't think it's coincidental.
Neither do I. I just find it hilarious that people are treating the worldviews of 2 sides, which is very complex, based off of 4% of the country.
Well, and when you broaden the width of polarities, you shorten the width of the golden mean, which sits in between them.
Yep.
And so if you're looking at, there's only so much space on a line, and it's cut up into thirds. If you take both of those thirds on the ends and you bring them into the center, that center third is going to look a lot smaller than those 2 big ones.
Yeah.
And so if in our perception of truth, if we only look at those 2 sides, we see the truth that is the combination of the 2 sides, which happens to be the majority. So if we take that line and then we kind of add a dimension and make it a bell curve, the majority of that third, of the middle third, we see that less because we're paying more attention to the 2 on the ends of the bell curve.
Yeah. Yeah, which is hilarious. Like, to take one specific example for immigration, most socialists, progressive liberals to socialist voters, have the viewpoint of, well, all these people that have paid so much money and risked their lives to get here should be allowed to be in the country. If you ask them the question, does that mean everyone should be allowed to come here, that there's no vetting process? Most of them will tell you, well, no, of course not. We should actually make sure that we're not just letting in anybody who's dangerous, right? But if you listen to people on the right side of the horseshoe from liberalism, they will tend to think that, no, they just want complete open borders, like California and New York tends to make it sound like. But if you ask people on the right side of the horseshoe their views on it, like, do you really want to keep it to where no one can come here? They will say, well, absolutely not. All of us are technically immigrants in some form. No one was born on the land. Technically, our ancestors all started from Africa, which would mean everyone is an immigrant to some form. Now, of course, I don't think that bolsters the argument of that we're a country of immigrants.
Right.
That argument, let's call it what it is, narrative, is trying to hyper focus on a specific part of immigration, not the whole concept of immigration. But anyway, if you ask people on the right, well, do they think that no one should be allowed to come here, even if they were targets? Well, no, that's not it. We just think that there should be some process to maintain rule of law, because that's what makes our country, most of the West, the way it is the rule of law. And as I talked about with one of the members of my band, if you just allow people to be here illegally, to which he had mentioned that, this narrative coming out from Trump's administration on illegal immigrants is ridiculous. And I was like, well, first of all, the idea of illegal immigrants has been around all the way back to the Romantic period. So to say it's a new narrative makes no sense. Now, of course, is the way Trump is using it a new form? Sure, I wouldn't disagree with that. But to say that that means the whole idea in terms of illegal immigrants is just false. Again, a construct.
Yeah.
Is ridiculous because, again, it has been around since the idea of nations in the Romantic period. They're not looking to make it to where no one can come here. They think people should be able to come here. But again, the most important thing is rule of law. And if you're here illegally, that is breaking the rule of law. Mm-hmm. Which means what else should be allowed to be broken within the law for people to maintain this society? Again, it's the whole idea, and this is why I'm saying it's so ridiculous to say that people on the left side of the horseshoe, from progressive liberals to socialists, think that just everyone should be able to be here freely.
Right.
It's so ridiculous because they understand that one of the things that makes the country the way it is the rule of law. And if you just let anyone here, which breaks the rule of law, well, then you don't have a country anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, and I've talked about this to people on a micro level, where, you know, you have an adolescent that likes to show delinquency and kind of break rules and push boundaries. If you don't set up a construct to react to that in I would say a legalistic manner, that boundary is going to be continuously pushed. And then on a macro level, when you have an obstruction of law or a reinterpretation of law, and we keep pushing borders, no pun intended, of of the concept or the structure of the law or the legislation, it inadvertently makes the society as a whole ask the question, especially if the foot is put down on a particular point, well, why did we stop there?
Yeah.
That's it completely undermines the system, because now there's this massive relativity that's in our face of, well, if we're able to push this, then why aren't we able to go to the nth extent?
Yeah.
And so, you know, that's, I think, to your point, a very implicit but very pertinent reaction that happens when things such as this happen. And that's not to say that rules shouldn't be broken. I think that rules absolutely should be broken, because that's the only way you make new rules and apply the rules to a modern context. Those are kind of the two sides of this. But as I was saying before I said this, there's a mean between the two, that it's a challenging the rules for the expansion of the law rather than challenging the rules for the absence of the law. And I think that that's kind of the mix here, because when, you know, you have archetypally, you have Harry Potter, for example. You know, Peterson talks about this a little bit there. Archetypally, Harry Potter is displayed as the person that masters the rules and then knows how to break them. Maybe that's the catalyst, is that you have to master the rules before you can break them, or else you're just perpetuating this relative nature that has no order, and it is perpetual chaos. And so, within the context of this conversation and this instance of border control and security, are the individuals that are making claims and criticisms of the administration's policy absolute experts in the policy itself? I don't think so, because there's this mass social trend of becoming an expert on a tenth of the information that is actually there, and then assuming the other 90%. And so, you know, that you have experts in the field you don't hear of, because they're not saying, like what we're talking about, the buzz news, the stuff that gets the candidates, the stuff that gets the policies, the stuff that gets the power, but it is in having the completion of that knowledge that you can genuinely assess the rules themselves. Otherwise, you are just making assumptions based upon the entirety of the law, left or right.
Yeah. Yeah, well, you've already pointed out a concept on post-structuralism, which is very fascinating, but with everything else you've delved into, there's another concept that's very important. So, for instance, when I took Metaphors We Live By for philosophy as a class, I had a classmate that asked, so what would the world be like if we didn't think this way? And we were talking about Plato. And the professor, Dr. Miller, goes, well, we had Plato. This is how we think. We'll never know. The reason why I'm bringing that up is, to your point, when it comes to this idea about law, Hobbes, when he wrote the first idea of what we call the social contract in Leviathan, he's trying to create a moral law. What we found out, though, is you can't make a moral law. Laws cannot be moral.
No.
And so this is a part of our thinking, I would say, within the West, especially in the U.S., is this idea that law can be moral, which is why everybody, I would argue, to go back to our tangents on dualism, tend to always go on about, well, this is what the law is supposed to do, but look at what law enforcement did. And it's just like, there's always going to be trade-offs. If you want no crime, then you have to take away all freedom. By allowing freedom, you are going to run into crime. And this is where Haidt and especially Vervaeke go on about, it's not about maximization of everything. You can't. To our conversations in the past, if you want to maximize pleasure all the time, then that just, whatever you maximize it to, if it's always at 10, it just becomes the new 0. You don't want a maximization, you want an optimization. And that's what our systems within the West are trying to do, is create a system of optimization. And that's why many of our founding fathers and philosophers and people like Thomas Paine said that that would have to be addressed and change and adapt over time, because everything we'd put into place would not be able to account for everything in the future that was to come. On top of that, so that's just to address the way our dualistic thinking of thinking, because it's meant to be moral, it should not ever do any evil or wrong. The other thing is the post-structural element. Reading Foucault's Archaeology of Knowledge, what he's actually arguing is, okay, what he's saying is, if you look at the archaeology, so in other words, you take the idea of words and structures and language as archaeological. In other words, the reason why he's saying archaeology is you don't want it to treat it as if it's historical fact. When you're doing archaeology, this is the best example I can come up with. Let's say you have records that talk about an art piece back in ancient Egypt, and you're searching around the pyramids for it, and you find a tomb, and you find this piece, you're like, okay, based off of the descriptions, this piece, as best as possible, we have found the piece. And then 2 tombs over, you find something that meets the description of that piece more than the first one you did. That's how archaeology, from what I understand, tends to work. And that's what Foucault is trying to say. This is how this history of studying language should work. It should not be definitive, because, for instance, I can give you a great example of this. Take our word love.
Right.
And how it's being used in the social sphere, being political. So Foucault argues that it's not a gradual evolutional development of language. It is, things die off quickly and some things just appear out of nowhere when constructing the concepts around words. And what he's saying is, we should, one of his best quotes, and I know I'm kind of setting this all up here, is, power isn't everything, but it is everywhere. One of the biggest problems with our culture is it's constantly treating power as if it's all that there is, that it's everything, not that it's everywhere. And what he means by that is, for instance, again, let's use the word love. You hear a lot now within the LGBTQ movement and people on the left of the horseshoe, being progressive liberals to socialists, that we should be letting love overwhelm and not let it die, and we should abolish hate. Okay, Foucault would say, well, let's look at the structure that has been created, the construct, the construction behind this way of how it's being used in today. And what you will find is it is not the same as it was in the 60s and 70s. So, for instance, if we look at the terms of let love spread and overwhelm the world and tear down violence and hate in the 60s, the two terms, many people, for instance, will listen to the song Children of the Grave by Black Sabbath and hear that whole thing of saying, you, the younger generation that is not jaded, need to maintain and show that love is still alive to overcome this world of atomic fear, right? Based off of the time they were living in. Many people on the left of the horseshoe will listen to that song and go, yep, that's exactly what we're doing. But if you look at the way they're using love and the construct behind it, the force and the use behind it is not the same as the one today. That one is saying that this is all about prioritizing life between everyone on the planet. Right now, for those on the left of the horseshoe, for LGBTQ issues and all that, they're saying love within specific ideas and context, and that anyone who is not in agreement with that should be removed or not allowed to be a part of society because it is deemed hateful. The terms hateful were not being used in the 60s. So according to Foucault's analysis, or using a Foucaultian analysis of this term, we would then see that the two terms, even though it's using the same word, the construct behind it is completely different.
Right.
Which therefore, because of the force that is being used within it, has a power behind it. So it's not the power that's important. It's the fact that because of the influence, power follows it. That's why it's everywhere, not everything. So yeah, to your point, when it comes to this idea of the law, yeah, it's going to be reinterpreted differently over time, and it should, because things are going to come up that change the way it would have been used before. This is why many on the left of the horseshoe argue about gun control is, okay, well, we don't live in the same time that this law was put down for the right to bear arms. But the problem is, the best way I can kind of explain this is to switch to another issue, is let's take trans athletes. It amazes me how when it comes to whether or not trans women, it's never about trans men, really. It's trans women
That's true.
being able to be in sports. The right immediately goes to the law. The left immediately goes to harm. Because, as Jonathan Haidt points out, their moral foundation is primarily maximize care, minimize harm. They tend not to care about the other 4 or 5 moral foundations.
Right.
The right cares about all the moral foundations, but I would argue in our time, and maybe there's data to back this up, it tends to be the respect for authority and loyalty that is more important to conservatives and those on the right of the horseshoe of liberalism. So again, the problem with the trans argument is the right always goes to the law. Well, it's against the law, according to Title IX. It's like, okay, but I should back up real quick. The problem of the conversation is they treat it based off of their language as a moral conversation. We've already said that having a law does not make it moral. Yet the right of the horseshoe, being liberals to conservatives, always jump to the law when it comes to it being moral. The left of the horseshoe to socialists, so progressive liberals to socialists, always jump to there being someone harming someone, which requires, this is why the oppressed versus oppressor language is so high, is because you have to have someone when it comes to this idea of maximize care, minimize harm. Well, harm is caused by something, so there has to be a perpetrator causing harm. Who's causing harm for trans athletes by telling them they can't play in a certain division or certain sport with a certain group of people? There's no harm there. But that's the immediate argument they go to. In other words, this isn't a perfect analogy, but if I purposely cut off my arm, which then limits the kind of sports I can go into, I should not be upset that I'm not allowed to play certain sports. Trans individuals have made a choice, which then limits the certain things that they can do. That's just life. That's not inflicting of harm.
Trade-offs.
Yes, that's a trade-off. So it's very interesting when it comes to this idea of how we're formulating language around law, that within the trans debate, to use as an example, again, they make it a moral issue. The right always goes to the law. Law does not make it moral. The left always goes to harm. Now, of course, there is some legitimacy to the left's argument, because what they're arguing is that the individual is being removed access to the commons, which is by many people's interpretations and definitions unethical. But again, the difference here is that there is no one specifically saying they can't play sports. They're just saying they can't play in specific leagues for specific kinds of sports.
Right. And I would say that it's not necessarily the commons either, because I can't go and compete in that league either.
Right.
You know?
Exactly.
And to kind of paraphrase what you're talking about, absolutes are inherently reductionistic.
Yes.
And when I think about that idea, I think about a equalizer on a radio. I know those don't really exist too often nowadays, but anybody who mixes music knows what I'm talking about too. You have a variety of frequencies, and each level kind of changes the spectrum of frequencies. Now, to use the Foucaultian idea of power being everywhere, that's the music flowing through the system at all times.
Yeah.
You adjusting what frequency, so say I pull up a particular frequency to the nth extent, that means inherently that all the other frequencies have to go down to the very bottom in this idea.
Yeah, it's taking this one and raising the intensity of that frequency.
Yes.
And if it's on the lower end, that's things that we feel. Anything
Yes.
on the bass end, so low end, we can't really hear. It's what we feel. And the higher you go up in EQing for the frequency, the more it hurts the ears. Whereas the low end just tends to muddy up the mix.
And if you throw a particular frequency up to the nth extent, it completely causes unbalance within the entirety of the mix.
It washes out everything else, yeah.
And in my opinion, when we're trying to describe this idea, it's like throwing up one of those mixers and all of the rest of them coming down to the absolute lowest. Now, to kind of draw in that music that's continually playing through the system, the power that's inherently here, that's everywhere, that's going to be channeled through that frequency.
Yes.
And so kind of just to paint a picture about that idea, that I'm envisioning the equalizer. And now a proper mix is a general curve through low end, kind of like a bell curve. You have your high ends and your low ends kind of lower down, and then your mid ranges kind of come up to a nice bell. And that is the equilibrium of the, well, and I wouldn't even say equilibrium, and this even goes further to the idea, it's the balance. Not necessarily equal. The frequencies don't necessarily need to be equally leveled to have a distribution of power, but they do need to be balanced. In that term, meaning the quality of the sound coming out. What is the quality of our society? What is the quality of the social system that we live in? And then to that point, adjusting how the power flows through the system to balance out that power in a pragmatic way.
Yeah.
Not necessarily an equal way, because I don't think equal necessarily always means good.
Yeah. Well, and to take your example even further with the examples that we've given, in danger of sounding like a moral relativist and a emotional or a moral emotivist, you realize that, okay, there is an issue here. This is in many ways a moral issue with the trans thing, for instance, because there are women who are being harmed. Not all of them, but there are women that are being harmed. And since the goal this is what to me is so interesting, to go off on a quick tangent. The left side of the horseshoe is all about maximizing care, minimizing harm. But for some reason, due to, as we talked about a few episodes ago, due to that idea of focusing on the need of the party rather than a consensus, like the Republicans used to be, there is that issue where, okay, well, they're trying to maximize care for the LGBTQ plus group at the expense of another group, instead of maximizing care for all, which is why I think so many people are disenfranchised with the Democrat Party. Now, of course, I'm not saying that champions the Republican, because as we've seen, there are more independent voters now than there have ever been.
Right.
So that would say that both sides are facing issues. But anyway, to get back to the point, what's so interesting is, okay, well, there is a moral element here, especially even within the progressive liberal to socialist side, about maximizing care and minimizing harm, because we should be that's what the argument is okay, well, let's think about, as an arbitrator, trans women and women. And if we see that trans men being in a sport does create a significant more statistic of harm compared to before, shouldn't that be something we should be minimizing ethically? Okay, you would think yes, but again, to be in danger of being a moral emotivist or a moral relativist, your example with the EQ is like the right saying, well, I want more highs, which is harsher on the ears, and the left saying, well, I want more lows, which is more felt in the chest.
Yeah.
And what they're not wanting to discuss is, well, to your point, they're wanting to maximize the frequency on both ends and say this is the moral issue.
Right.
When this is why I'm saying I'm in danger of this territory, but maybe I'm not. Maybe it's actually, to use the example, they're in danger of being relativists because it's based off of preference rather than actually analyzing the actual issue, which would be trying to find that balance of what is going on.
Yeah, and I've seen that show up in a very, very obscure idea that's shown contemporarily between the difference of equality and equity.
Yeah.
And it's very scary to me to see that because I've seen speeches of party members talking about how equity is where everyone ends up in the same place. And that to me is absolutely terrifying because it's not finding balance in a mixing system. It's maxing out or leveling down to zero all of the EQ channels, whatever makes it all equal in the end.
Yeah,
that's the equitable that I've heard people use, versus equality being everybody kind of starts in the same place, I guess.
Well, I can use your example to really round out what you're saying even better, which is the theory of it should be a bell in equalizing is great in theory, but it depends on the tracks you're given for a mix.
Yeah. Because
sometimes some tracks can have way too high mids, your lows can have too high or not enough lows, that you have to actually do something. And there are many times in the end, like for instance, a great example is in one of Devin Townsend's songs, a mixer had heard a very slight sound, which was probably bouncing somewhere off of the room for the choir track. And he said, well, I wonder why the heck they left that in there. That should have been, to your point, balanced out within the EQ for everything to have its space. And then he went in and tried to get rid of it. And what he found is it harmed the track more than it actually did help it. So in theory, it sounds great, but sometimes with the tracks you're dealt with, it just doesn't work. So to put that with your example, I'll use a different example. For instance, with Trump's executive order on homelessness, of combating homelessness because of the level in crimes that are happening with it. Do I think it's a bit harsh for it? Yeah, I would agree, but I would definitely agree with the liberal side that there is kind of an issue of empathy towards it. But you then have individuals who I know that are saying we should be campaigning for these programs that are all about helping homelessness get out of addiction and stuff to integrate them back into society. It's like, okay, well, just like the equalizing theory, it's great in theory. But as Jonathan Haidt says in The Righteous Mind, liberals tend to be a bit naive. They tend to think if we can maximize the potential and chances for everybody, then we'll get a equitable outcome.
Yes.
The problem is, just like with the homelessness situation, you can have all these programs that want to maximize the opportunities to get all of them integrated into society. But what are you going to do with the few homeless people, or handful or more, that don't want to change, don't want to get out of addiction, and don't actually want to integrate back into society?
Yeah, and I think, that's a issue of how we perceive what we perceive when time is involved, in terms of highly optimistic perspectives and highly critical perspectives. And I would be aligning that highly critical perspective to more right-leaning individuals and highly optimistic to more left-leaning. And optimism's great, and a critical nature is great too, in a balance. But I see with a highly optimistic orientation, you're looking way out at the top of the mountain, and you're not looking at the path before you.
Yeah, before you've even started climbing.
Right. And with the hypercritical, you're not looking at the mountain. You look at what the path that you've already trekked, and implying the path that you're going to take on to reach the top of the mountain based upon what you've already trekked. And
yes.
that's the historical perspective of conservatism versus the structural optimism of hyperliberalism, I would say.
Yeah, and I think that's a very good analysis. And I want to put more emphasis on the right of, with your analogy, yes, they are looking back to better understand the problem. The problem is, as liberals point out, is it's out there.
Right.
It's the next valley to go through and mountain to climb.
Right.
But the issue with the right's tendency to be very critical of ideas is that they think that they're preventing an issue and not realizing, well, regardless of whether or not you want it, an issue and problem is going to arise from this that has to be addressed. And I would argue there's a huge tendency within the U.S. for conservatives and Republican voters. Conservatives, I really should stop calling that, because, sorry, with everything I've studied, I don't really know many conservatives in this country.
Yeah.
And I'm willing to change that if I meet people, but based off of people who call themselves conservatives that are talk show hosts and everything, I don't really see them as conservative. Anyway, they tend to ignore any future problem that the left points out will be a problem until it's directly in their face, and it can't be avoided anymore.
Yeah, and it's going back to an idea we've discussed prior in this episode, is the willingness to break rules and the willingness to strictly abide in them. And I think both are a lack of edification, because the middle way stands in a knowing that there was a path that you've already trekked and a path that you need to continue to trek, because you can't stop. And in that, there's a complete knowing of the, I wouldn't say complete, a well-rounded knowledge of the issue, the topic, the consensus, or the multiple consensi. And then from that point of well-edified knowledge, you make a decision. And if that decision's breaking the rules, you can solidify why you broke the rules. You don't have to rely on some optimistic structuralist fantasy, and you can abide in the rules, and you don't have to stick your ground in some historical, only gonna look what's behind me perspective. You have a basis from which you're actually making decisions. And I was listening to something earlier about choice, and far too frequently do we make choices based upon, we make choices without the entirety of ourselves making that choice. We often make choices, and then there's maybe parts of us that are resentful, or parts of us that are in resistance to making that choice. And far too little do we make a choice with every bit of ourselves. Yeah. And I think that's a good way to look at an individualistic level. What we're talking about on a social level is, how do we understand the present and the circumstances of the moment enough to make a choice with every bit of ourselves, rather than putting a bet here, putting a line out there, and seeing what works. That is, I think, a very challenging and hard path to trek, and that's why I think too many people choose the formerly described trek, which is either you're highly optimistic or you're highly historical.
Yeah. Well, it makes sense that we don't fully, with our entire being, quote unquote, commit to a decision, because as A psychiatrist once said, you have all these options, which creates decision paralysis. But the reason why people don't like making a decision of what they're wanting to do is that by choosing something, you sacrifice being able to make all these other choices.
Right.
Yeah, that's difficult. I can attest to that as someone who's able to do many different things very well. Being told, well, based on our society, you kind of only can pick 2 or 3. It's like, but then I lose all these other opportunities.
Yeah.
And that's the cost, is by picking something, you lose opportunities and other things, but you get this opportunity. So it makes sense that we're that way. But yeah.
And with that too, you know, it's a part of it is a paralysis of making decision. But I think understanding the fact that, and the reality of the scenario, it is that we can't really stand in the middle of 2 doorways with 99.9% of decisions we make day to day. You can't. It's a illusion of the mind that you can stand in uncertainty, because all you really have is the context that you live in, which is the product of the decisions you've made, your current will, which is to make decisions based upon your prior context into the future. And that is always forward moving. And there's no, oh, I went through this door, I want to like switch routes. That in and of itself is a route forward.
Yeah.
There's no turning back. There's only moving forward. It's rather a direction into doorways that you have to completely commit to, knowing that you are making consequences, good or bad, and then moving from there. And if there needs to be a readjustment, there needs to be a readjustment. But that in and of itself is a choice you make completely on with yourself too.
Yeah, I agree. Well, and that's what really bothers me about. Well, I guess I should make the comment now. I'm not trying to say that one side should do something or not. I'm not saying one side is better than the other. To me, from a psychological point of view, with both of us being psychology students, I would say that there is a disorder mentally within our culture. And I don't see solving that issue by saying one side is better than the other when both sides are displaying the same behavioral tendencies. So to your point, the reason why I bring that up is the way our politics works is kind of like the 2 major schools of ethics in ethics. You have utilitarians saying this is the way ethics works, it's how it should work. And then you have deontology, Kantians, saying no, this is how it works. Kant is all about you make a principle, you have to stick to that principle. Utilitarianism is, well, what are the consequences? And all that matters is the consequences. And both sides have had to, over time, due to the shortcomings of the ethical systems, make adjustments to adapt to the criticisms that have been levied at them. But a ethical system, which is probably one of the oldest ethical systems starting the school of ethics, is Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, which is a great book. And that started to come on the rise again under care ethics from feminism in the 80s, which is exactly what you're describing, which is, okay, I'll actually give a personal example. I know it's anecdotal, but I'll give a personal one. So being in a band, and a part of a community, which is a very punk rock metal community, which I find hilarious being a psychology philosophy student to see all the things they stand for, and yet they tend to be in opposition to it in their actions.
Right.
Anyway, that's as my ethics professor stated, shows you that they operate off of their beliefs, not actually what's logical. Anyway, we had this incident come up where someone was found to had a pretty questionable history. And we made a decision when we were called together before this show came up to decide what were we to do. We let the person speak, we let everybody in the community that showed up speak, and then we made a decision based off of that. Information came out later that we weren't given the whole story. So we made a different decision. The reason why I bring that up is that is Aristotle's ethics.
Mm-hmm.
That is understanding that it's contextual,
Mm-hmm.
and there's no principle which is going to use Kant, that's going to solve every situation, every context. To utilitarianism, there is nothing where you can focus on the consequences and that it will always create the best outcomes and the moral,
Right.
ethical outcome. So you just kind of have to decide, to your point, based off of the information you have. Now, within America, that's a bit of a problem. And the reason why it's a problem within the US is we tend to have this mentality that if you make a decision, if you're consistent, then somehow that makes you authentic, genuine, and therefore moral.
Yeah.
Which is where I would argue that is kind of, maybe it's the other way around. I don't know. This is me just speculating here. But it seems like that is the symbiotic relationship that's created this whole idea that authenticity is in and of itself moral. But the thing that is so weird to me to address cognitive dissonance within that idea is, okay, so do you think Goering at the Nuremberg trials, or let's say those that were SS officers, should they have stuck to their guns and been consistent?
Yeah.
Well, if they did, we would have said that they were evil and
Right.
completely immoral people. The concept of being consistent, which makes you genuine, authentic, and therefore moral, is not given to them.
No.
Understandably and rightfully so. So why should we do that here? In other words, there would be people that would sit there within our country with the way we tend to act, which is why cancel culture bothers all sides of politics, is we made a decision. It ended up being not the best decision, which means to everyone that would have been on the outside looking in, if something happened because of that decision, we would have been blamed for it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm willing to take responsibility, but we made the decision based off of the information we had. And then when we got more information, we adjusted and made a different decision. Which, to your point, okay, that's life. Things are always changing, and you don't have all the information. This is why Nietzsche's perspectivism is so important to me, because it argues that there is no one eye like God's that can see and understand everything.
Right.
So you have to try and understand different perspectives as much as possible. The downside of that is, because I grew up in a conservative family, but have read a lot of things on liberalism, and even stuff for progressive liberalism and socialism, just because I understand both perspectives does not mean I have an eye in both. It means I have a new perspective standing on the outside of it. It does not mean I have an eye that's able to switch all over. It means I can think about each side differently, but I still have my own perspective based on that from that.
And maybe, if there is an eye, you're not it.
Yeah, exactly. That's the more important thing. Yeah.
Right. I think that's a whole different conversation if there's an eye, but if there's an eye there, you're not it. And I think that I was thinking about consistency and the weird moral conundrum we place upon it. And I think that's because we as humans like change. Or we hate change, sorry. Yeah. And we value somebody who doesn't change because their actions are predictable. And in a archaic society, you needed predictability because that was a deterrent against social.
It helped with survival.
Yeah, well, yeah, and it helped with people not contrasting the social contracts. So if somebody was consistent, you knew that they were going to do what they said they were going to do, and so you could trust them more, and through that trust, you could depend on them more, and they were more of a resource. And so I think that's kind of the trail of consistency, and I think that's true, but I do think that when you place moral weight upon it, it completely loses that meaning in and of itself and becomes some weird bastardized version of it where you have it define as a virtuous thing, when in and of itself it's a personality, not a virtue.
Yeah, well, and what you're describing is a Kantian degree.
Yeah.
Because it's saying, by principle, being consistent is
Right.
moral. But again, to your point, we claim, I would like to add that into your statement, we claim we like consistency.
Yeah. Yeah.
But when time comes,
Yeah.
when change is needed, we hate someone who does not want to adapt to that change.
Mm-hmm.
Because just as someone who couldn't be reliable when that was called for,
Right.
is a hindrance to the group in their survival, when the environment or things change, someone who does not want to adapt to that is also a hindrance to the group.
Yeah, and I wonder how much of that, that really deep-rooted ability to trust somebody who's consistent because their actions. I think maybe that might be the basis from which we talked about the kind of the historical tradition-based ideologies that are more right. And I know we hate using right, left, blah, blah. But, they're more right in nature because there is that archaic, and I don't say archaic in terms of a degradance, but like a traditional basis of the nuclear family, of the kind of the tight-knit tribe that a lot of right politics operates on as their foundation for the ideal. And so out of that, they want consistency because that exemplifies a exploration and a example of that survival instinct that's very group oriented, which is weird. And I'm glad that we actually got to this because I wanted to bring this up in this conversation, because left-leaning politics tends to be more social in nature.
Yes.
Yet there's this contrasting hyper-individualism that comes out of left-leaning politics that is inherently contrasting their social nature that dually exists, which in and of itself is contradictory. And conversely, with right-leaning politics, we have this I don't want to call it tribalism because tribalism seems that it's bad, but I'm using tribalism in the word of consistently integrated social systems that in and of themselves that right-leaning politics contrast with the hyper-individualism that conservatism brings through like a libertarian perspective, you could say. And so there's this kind of weird dichotomy on both sides, and I think we're just pointing out further distortions on both ends of the curve, that you have social basis but hyper individualism, and then you also have social basis but hyper individualism.
Yeah, for sure. And I would like to delve more into your idea on hyper individualism.
Yeah.
But there's something based off of what you're talking about you should understand, which is there's a reason I say I don't really believe or know very many conservatives.
Right.
Conservatism is younger than liberalism because it starts with Edmund Burke, who really starts founding what we call conservatism during the French Revolution, which is after the Enlightenment principles were founded with Locke, Rousseau, and Hobbes and all that. This is the reason, and maybe we should delve into this too, the reason why I don't like the terms left and right is the history behind it.
Yeah.
The term left and right comes from France, and those who sat on the left of the king, who wanted a more democratic, republic, enlightened society, and those who sat on the right of the king, who wanted to maintain what we call a perennialist society, which was that it's evolutional. We can analyze this all evolutionarily, which is, okay, you think about during biblical times. Mm-hmm. You had city-states and or groups of people, and they elected people like a pharaoh or such, which is what helped that society gain knowledge, share a culture, which helped it survive.
Right.
That then adapts, you could argue, to the time period of just before the Enlightenment and during the Enlightenment of monarchies, which was that the king held all the power because it was ordained by God. And that was a decision, evolutionarily, I would argue, from an evolutional psychology point of view, that helped society say, okay, regardless of what happens, we have found that putting the decisions in the hand of one individual at the top is better. Does that mean that every single offspring that comes from that king enables these traits? No, that's the trade-off. But it had helped so many societies survive to that point. But by the time I would argue, so this is my views, not historically backed up, and maybe it is, by the time we get to the Enlightenment, society has adapted so much that monarchy cannot keep up with the issues that are there. So you have, again, a view on the left side of the king, which states, this is the thing that's going to help us adapt to these oncoming issues. And then you had those on the right of the king saying, things should remain the way they are. Perennialism is not conservatism.
Right.
Edmund Burke respected and admired Locke's work. He just didn't agree with, to use Toss's word, the airiness of liberalism. Because, as saw in the French Revolution, they thought that they could create a whole new society, a whole new, quote, man, unquote, for the world to see. And what ended up happening was nothing but a few reigns of terror, and then a revolution that didn't end until Napoleon crowned himself emperor, but then continued to fight wars on a campaign of empire, which is probably one of the last greatest, biggest empires we've seen, just for after that, for there to be more tiny forms of revolution. It never settled down. So Edmund Burke's analysis was these core beliefs, individual rights, natural rights, are important. Edmund Burke, though, compared to Locke, Locke says that these rights are a part of nature. Burke argues we inherit them. They're not there because anyone can take it away. He then also argues that these ideas of a liberal and enlightened society are great, but they have to be founded in something. Right. Meaning, again, that's why I said it's airy.
Yeah.
It has to still be on the ground. It's great in theory, but there has to be something that connects it to what's actually happening in life.
Yes.
So conservatism, to your point, is being able to say, okay, we have this tradition. Traditions are important. Let me give an example so we can understand what it is of why I say I don't know very many conservatives. The general argument that I tend to hear from people who call themselves conservatives when the terms of traditions is you go, okay, why do we have traditions? Their answer is because they're there for a reason. You go, okay, well, why are they there for a reason? Because traditions are made for that. You then ask, okay, why the tradition though? Because they're there for a reason. It's a circular argument.
Right.
Conservatism is all about educating oneself as to why the tradition is there. Not that just traditions are important, but as to why. So, for instance, we have traditions like Israelis and Jewish people have traditions like the bar mitzvah. If that tradition ever got to the point, like with our culture, where initiation rites were lost, the only way they'd be able to actually keep that tradition is if they went back and understood, well, why did we even create the idea of a bar mitzvah? And then if they see that it could then be restored in an updated fashion to the current day, they can do that. If they see that it actually serves no purpose or is a hindrance, this is the thing that tends to shock people who aren't conservative, you can be rid of it.
Right.
It is not about, and this is, you also have to understand, based off of psychology, we use the terms that we use here in the US. Liberal, which traditionally is not what they are. For our culture, we call progressive liberals liberal. For people who are not that are more libertarian or Republicans, we call conservative. And what they have found personality-wise is that liberals are more open-minded, willing to try new things, and are artistic. Conservatives tend to be very reluctant to change. That's not conservatism, that's perennialism. I don't know, this is my opinion or my thought process, I don't know if the reason why the right is the way they are is because of the terms left and right, that they kind of just took on the role of what the right was, which is perennialism, or if it's because the left saw that their reluctance to change started calling them the right because of that being a perennialistic mentality. Right. I don't know. But I just wanted to lay that out there as to why I don't call many people conservatives. Yeah. But moving on to another point you had said, what is interesting to me, and this is the reason why I'm bringing this up, this lines up with what you're talking about. You were bringing up the importance of a tribe.
Yeah.
The reason I would say we have a problem with that word is because of the U.S. liberal mentality for the word tribe.
Yeah.
Which is that it requires authority, a respect for authority, and loyalty, which, according to Haidt statistics, liberals don't rate high in.
Yeah.
They actually tend to dislike it. They tend to rate high in maximize it or care and /harm, moral foundation. What really weirds me out, though, is that, well, let me back up real quick. I understand why liberals have an issue with loyalty. And another reason why I was bringing up the conservative argument is many people who call themselves conservatives don't understand how loyalty works. So, for instance, if we have a system that is harmful, let's say like before the civil rights movement with how African Americans were being treated, you have people who will argue, well, this is how it's been, we shouldn't violate that because of loyalty.
Right.
But they don't understand that, realizing that how African Americans were being treated was in opposition to how things needed to be and the idea of equal rights and equal opportunity for everybody. Again, based off of social contract theory with Hobbes, it says if you stay here, you tacitly comply. So because African Americans stayed here, they tacitly complied. How many of them really had the means to actually leave?
Right.
Secondly, because you're in society, you reap the benefits of it. Well, African Americans weren't reaping the benefits of the social contract. Okay, so since that is the law, were African Americans getting that? No, but you had many people who called themselves conservatives who were saying this is how the system is, we shouldn't change it. That's not loyalty.
Right.
But this is why the left doesn't like it, because this is how they see loyalty. Loyalty would actually be understanding we must uphold the ideal, and if that means the thing needs to change to meet the ideal, that is being loyal to the ideal.
A transcendent loyalty.
Yes, exactly. So the thing that weirds me out, though, with the left is they have an unhealthy loyalty to the care-harm ethic, to the point that it's naive and detrimental. They also have a hard time understanding sacredness, as Jonathan Haidt points out in his book, because it kind of explains a lot about our culture. If you have an individual that we look highly upon, and then we find out about the terrible things they did in their personal life, we'll want to put that as an attribute to them, as we do in the West of always wanting to have the attributes to the individual rather than external circumstances like the East does, or has the tendency to. And then write that off as if that's them the entire time. Like, right. It amazes me how in our culture, I can give a great example of this, that people will walk around, meet people and think, wow, they're super nice. They must believe and agree with what I think in my politics. They'll get to know their person. They'll think and they'll speak very highly of them to other people. But then they'll find out about their politics being in opposition And immediately they start attributing everything about what they don't like about someone, hypothetically, that they've thought about that to that individual. They'll completely erase everything they knew about the individual because of something they thought. And it's like, well, geez, that's weird. And that's because of a lack of loyalty and respect for authority.
Mm-hmm.
But again, it kind of makes sense. If you have someone like Hitler, would you want undying loyalty to someone like that? Like, there has to be some healthy form of skepticism.
Yeah.
But as Haidt points out, the example he gives is liberals have, in our culture, which would be progressive liberals, have no problem, the example he gives, smearing shit over a painting of Jesus or Mary
Mm-hmm.
or what we consider to be sacred. But to appeal to the left, he goes, what's interesting is that if anyone on the right took a photo of Martin Luther King Jr. or Obama and smeared shit over it, the left would lose their mind.
Right.
So there's a different placement of sacredness of some forms. They just don't really realize to the degree of how they use it. But to me, it really weirds me out how much they uphold the care, harm, moral foundation to the point that it is actually very... They create this thing that is abstract as having ultimate authority and are very loyal to it.
Mm. And, you know, we're talking about this seemingly contradictory circumstance that resides in both conservative and liberal parties, of this individualistic mentality and this collectivistic mentality placed in different spots. And I think the sacred aspect points to where it might be pointed, but that's here nor there, but it's placed. And I've been reading a lot on Erik Erikson's work and the psychosocial kind of stuff that he's derived, and
Child and adult development.
Yeah, and the lifespan development, you know,
Mm-hmm.
starting in childhood and going into the end of one's life. And he points out, and parallel to something that Darwin pointed out in terms of his ideas on social theory, that the individual needs the freedom to discover themselves within a society that allows them to belong. So you have the means to go about your life and aspirations that you see fit, yet, and that's the individualism, yet you are integrated psychosocially into a social structure that allows you and your aspirations to belong within a broader story of you. Something that transcends you. Because something that I think a lot of the existential crises that are happening, especially within individuals that are hyper individualistic, is that they don't have a transcendent story, something that outlives them, because their story is them, and it's that subjective relative quality that leaves the abyss open. And a society lasts longer than an individual.
Yeah.
So if you're connected to that story, there's a level of eternity that kind of you're able to abide in.
Yeah.
And so that balance, and I think we instinctually require that balance between belonging and freedom.
Yeah.
And that's why we see it on both ends of this bell curve represented so obtusely, because they're both looking for the sacred, and they're also looking for the individualistic, but they're doing so in obscure ways.
Yeah. I'd be curious what your thoughts are. Let's take that to, for instance, I brought up that I look at all this as from a psychological point of view, as if there is a disorder happening within society that needs to be addressed behaviorally and maybe even mentally. What's so interesting to me about what you said is I can't pinpoint what that is for what we call the right.
Uh-huh.
I can pinpoint it a lot easier for the left, but I don't think the left's version of it is healthy.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, I see more of a hyper-individualistic focus on the left. The right, to me, just feels unmoored, is the best way I can put it. I don't really know how to explain it. So, well, I guess I can. When it comes to the left, for instance, they want this shared narrative that people are just who they are and we should accept all of our differences. Right. The problem is, according to sociology and social psychology, all the data replicated shows overwhelmingly that you don't get people to build trust and unity by focusing on differences. You build trust and unity by getting them to focus on similarities.
Yeah, belonging.
And yet the left is going about it the complete opposite way. They want to focus on the differences. Again, the hyper individualism of things. But they have a narrative. The right's narrative is more of, we care about our values, which is the family, the community. What community? I don't really see, and maybe this is my fault because I'm not actively in one. You can say church is a community.
Right,
I don't disagree with that. But to the point of many people on the left and the right, there's a reason people are leaving the church in droves, is because it seems to be not fulfilling the things it claims to value. I guess an example to kind of say why I say it's unmoored is you have this weird sect of people saying that we should return to men being the breadwinners and women being at home. If you look at the data and our historical records, there has never been a time women haven't worked.
Right.
The time that people tend to refer to as women being barefoot, pregnant, and at home is the 50s and 60s. And that was for women who were in affluent tax brackets. So I'm thinking like Friedan, who started a feminist movement that women should be able to integrate and also have careers. Meaning highly educated. Now, of course, do I think women should be able to have been in college and getting highly educated like men were at the time? Yeah, I do. But this weird narrative that came out of it that up until that point women weren't working at all is BS. Yeah. It wasn't the case. And then the other thing that's really weird, and I've had personal experience with this, so take my anecdotal evidence with a grain of salt. I've had a few individuals who were saying, well, the wife should remain at home while I go do all the work. And they shouldn't be able to leave or do anything without telling me. I have the final say-so. Well, if you go to many of the way families worked back in the 50s and 60s and before that, with this idea of, barefoot and pregnant, that's not how it worked either. Women were allowed to go do as they pleased and hang out with the people they want. It was just required that they fulfilled the role of being the housekeeper, or that they were home on time to have a meal prepared for when the husband got home. Outside of that, they were able to go shop or do whatever they wanted within the means. There was no shackles to a patriarchal figure. And even during that time, to go on a different thing, since I'm bringing up the word patriarchy, because it was the wife's family, the bride, that paid for the wedding and also had the dowry, it wasn't the bride integrating into the groom's family. It was the groom always integrating into the bride's family. But she took the male's name. And it's been that way for a long time, which actually makes it still more matriarchal than patriarchal. But again, my whole point for bringing up this side tangent is the narratives that we see, again, in a very Foucaultian sense, they're not the same. We have an idea spring up out of nowhere from Friedan, or at least it seems like out of nowhere, during the 60s, and it changes the whole way we think about a family that point forward. But to get back on topic, this isn't a community shared narrative
No.
for the right.
No, and it's broken on both sides, and if you wanted to see a good example, I'd say turn your face to the east and start walking that way, because that's, I think, where, if anything, lies, and it's not within any first world nation, I don't think, that this is happening. And I would like to, bring up a relevant name in this, because we're not dealing with the ideas in their purity within the Western context. We're dealing with narratives, and I think a relevant name to mention is Nozick.
Right.
And these narratives are patterned differently.
Yes.
They're not necessarily they're different. No, the pattern, the narratives are fundamentally the same, and they're very, very stripped down version of needing belonging yet wanting individual freedom, but they're patterned differently. And I say that because the idea of patterning, if we haven't talked about it on this podcast, is that there's an idea, and that when Nozick describes patterning with that.
Sorry to interrupt. You mean Robert Nozick,
yes,
right? Okay.
Yes. And that within that, every interaction that falls underneath that society that has the pattern is consequently patterned to that narrative. And
right.
So this is how narratives form, and I think he's very underrated in terms of thinkers in the 20th century, because he described through and through how ideas from top level structures trickle down to individualistic notions. And I think that's how the left has patterned the narrative of the weird, distorted dichotomy between belonging and individualism.
Yeah.
Belonging in terms of belonging to the narrative, belonging to the pattern. Within the right, it gets a little more turbid, because it seems to be patterned top down as well, but in a different way, because it's not explicitly patterned that way.
Right.
It's patterned from the top, saying that it's patterned from the past.
Yes.
We're historical, quote unquote. Yet that in and of itself is a pattern.
Yes. Well, and I mentioned that I have an issue with what's happening because, from a psychological point of view, mentioning it a third time, that there seems to be like a disorder.
Uh-huh.
And I can give you a specific example just with this. There's never been a time in the U.S., because we have 50 different states which have different ecologies, different geographies, and different economics, that have ever thought the same way across the country.
Yeah.
If you go to conservatives in Montana, they're not going to think the same as conservatives over in Connecticut.
Right.
If you go to liberals in Connecticut, they're not going to think the same as liberals over in Iowa or also Montana. It is just, it's not the same.
No.
So there is this weird, distorted mentality happening within the U.S. that's acting as if, I'll use a philosophical term, but you also know the concept from psychology, which is theory of mind. Mm-hmm. But there seems to be a lack of, in philosophy, it's a recent word called sonder, which is realizing that people live and think and operate their own lives outside of your own, outside of your thoughts and outside of your perception. Like, things happen outside without you. In other words, to use a terrible example, the classic thing of if there's no one there in the forest and a tree falls, but no one's there to hear it, does it make a noise? Sonder is realizing, yes, it does. I'm just not there to see it. People, like, your relationship has its ups and downs when I'm not around. My relationship has up and downs when you're not around. It functions and operates without you. You are not pivotal to it at all. And I would argue there seems to be a huge lack of sonder within the U.S. in realizing that the way you think is not how everybody thinks.
Yeah. And maybe it's the lack of sonder is a distortion of chaos theory. Because, with chaos theory, and, this also delves into this weird bastardizing of Eastern thought, how the West has turned Eastern thought into like universal interconnectivity, which is a very potent Buddhist and other Eastern philosophies integrated as well. That, you know, your touch in the water has infinite ripples out into the edges of the body itself. I think that might be and that's bastardized with the West, causing that lack of sonder, and that in tandem with hyper-individualism, thinking that it is me, and that turns into an egoist type mentality. And from that point of view, you can absolutely see how there's a lack of sonder, because if it's all about my truth, my shortcomings, my challenges, all of me, there's no sonder to be had.
Yeah, exactly. And it personally worries me.
Yeah.
Because, again, kind of like with where we started in the conversation with immigration, you realize that both sides actually has a lot in common.
Mm-hmm.
But they see each other based off of a form that is not reflective of the actual conversation.
Which is a symptom of not actually wanting to know the whole story.
Correct.
And at this point, it's intentional.
It sure seems that way.
I think that I'm really, really patient in terms of allowing people to come to understanding of a broader story, but I really do think that there's an intentional quality of lacking our vision. And I think that we, on an individual level and a social level, I think we purposefully cut off the width of our vision because it is not compliant with the story that we tell ourselves.
Yeah.
And there's a lack of a willingness to change because of that possibly hyper individualistic egoic quality that's circulating. And I think that that's from a lack of social cohesion.
Right. Yeah, I agree. Well, and again, the reason why I'm saying I just don't see a community uniting narrative on the right side of the aisle is, for instance, you know, there's those stickers you go around, "We the people are over this." And it's like, okay, well, if you go back to the founding of our country, the idea of the will of the people does not mean the majority.
Right. It
means that those who are voted in try to meet to 100% as possible the will of the people, everybody.
Yeah.
But 100% is impossible.
The equalizer.
Correct. So if you have, for instance, the example I had a conversation with was, let's say Grand Junction, for instance, is 60% Christian and 40% LGBTQ plus. Just because it's 60%, or let's go even further. Let's say it's 75% Christian and 25% LGBTQ plus. Just because Christians hold the majority does not mean that everything should be kowtowed to them.
No.
When it comes to the will of the people, that means that the 25% LGBTQ plus still have a role and should have the ability to participate and do things within society. That is the will of the people. But if you ask many people on the right, and even the left does this now too, they tend to act as if the will of the people is the majority. That's not uniting or unifying. That's divisive, because that means that the 75% of Christians should always be kowtowed to, and that society should never bend the knee towards LGBTQ plus. But as much as I've railed on post-structuralism, one of the things I do enjoy of what bothers me about what the left has done with it is they tend to say that, okay, let's say, in this example, they would say in order to right the wrongs of what has happened, LGBTQ plus should be given 75% and Christians 25%. The problem with this idea and this narrative that has been created to say this will solve the problem is eventually, in 50 to 100 years to come, that 25% Christians will say, well, in order for us to right the injustices, we must give Christians 75% and LGBTQ plus 25%. And throughout time, it'll just keep fluctuating back and forth to, quote, right the wrongs, unquote. The post-structuralist argument says, no, you should just negate the power. So in other words, even though Christians have, in this hypothetical example, 75%, they should act as if they only have 50. That seems responsible, because your representatives should be trying to come to compromises that, again, meets the whole demographic, all of Grand Junction. But that's not what we do. We elect people who win for Republicans, and all they want to do is represent Republican voters. You elect someone who wins as a Democrat, and all they want to do is represent Democratic voters. And then they wonder why that creates so much division.
Well,
and then why it just goes back and forth like a ping pong ball between who gets voted for.
And we're the ping pong ball.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, well, it's my analogy, which I've have found other people have used as well. So it definitely shows you there's nothing new under the sun. It's just a pendulum.
Yeah.
And it's the voting side bashing up against 4 balls in the middle out of 6, and it's us that are stuck in the middle.
Right.
When in reality, we should just let the pendulum rest at some point, just to try and figure things out, because the only people that are getting movement and momentum are the far sides of the extreme.
You know, and what you bring up is really crucial, and I think dangerous to not look at, because I brought up earlier the word truth, and in this podcast we've talked about evolutionary perspective of truth being that all things are true, some things are more true than others. That takes into account the diversity of experience that is within a system. All experiences hold validity that sit under a system. Laws inadvertently pattern onto those experiences, the context from which those experiences can operate in relationship to the truths that they have, meaning their context of where they've been and where they sit currently.
Okay.
And if you don't have a system that rests on the top of this hierarchy, that understands and tries to represent the variety of truths that and experiences that are underneath them hierarchically, you have an undermining and unrepresentation of the variety of experience that sits within that system. And I think this is what we're talking about with narratives, is that the narratives inadvertently do that.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess I want to make sure I understand you correctly.
Yeah.
So I'll give you the way I think about it, and let's see if that aligns up with yours as well. So the way I tend to think of it, let's take a book.
Mm-hmm.
We're not going to talk about what's in the book, just that there's a book.
Yeah.
And I say something about the book. Again, not what's in the book, just it being an object. The way I look at it is, well, what I've said may align with the fact that whatever this thing is real, which is true, but it doesn't mean that the way I think about my choice of words or the thing aligns with that book.
Mm-hmm.
Which to me it's my analogy of showing, okay, well, you and I can say something about the book and it aligns with how each other thinks, which is that book. That's what makes it more true. But the way you and I think about how we think about things, about what comes to the reality of that book, is where things start to differ. And that does not make it true. That's where we diverge into different things. So in other words, to use a very Nietzschean idea of there is no truth, which is the first truth, such a statement aligns with truth, with reality, but it doesn't mean that the way I think about the world and that statement aligns with what is true about that statement. I might have butchered it.
No, I get what you're saying too, and I like to think of it in terms of language mapping on the individual and social basis. We have words that mean things socially and interpersonally, but those words are on an individual level mean completely different things for us based upon our experience and contexts. And so, the dog means a furry, four-legged animal that represents the form of a dog.
Right.
But if I was viciously attacked by one when I was a kid, that's going to mean dog is going to hold different weight for me than it is going to for you.
Yeah.
And so within that, with that being established, we have to, when we are creating social structure, we have to take into account the variety of experience that relates to collective things and in collective experiences such as structure, infrastructure, schooling, education, all these things that we meet other people at, that needs to be established in terms of surrounding the variety of experience that, to the degree it can, that may come into contact with other people within that system. And of course there's always going to be outliers, because there's, I would say, an infinite variety of experience. And it's not about meeting every experience. Yeah. It's about meeting the most.
Yeah.
Take the frequencies, for example. There's going to be, if anybody has a knowledge of harmonics, that there's an infinite array of harmonics that stack upon one another when there's a note off of a piano, overtones that go on forever past our audible recognition. Doesn't mean that we have to accommodate the frequencies to those inaudible overtones. We're trying to grasp the audible overtones, and not saying that those overtones aren't real, because they are and they exist. But it's about encapsulating the majority of the frequency in a balanced, harmonious manner. And I bring up the word harmony specifically, not only in terms of a music pun, but also because harmony in and of itself means a synchronicity of parts coming together to create a sustainable whole.
Right. Yeah, well, and it's, correct me if I'm wrong, it's a coexistence that is not, to use the stupid bumper sticker for religions on coexistence, it doesn't mean that every religion is equal.
Yeah.
It's based on within the society and context you're in, each has their rightful place.
Yeah.
So, for instance, within the U.S., being more of a Judeo-Christian society that also sways more atheistic, okay, then those have more sway, but it doesn't mean that the other ones can't coexist within that.
Right.
It doesn't mean that all of them are equal as the same. It just means that they each have their spot to function and coexist as possible.
And let's get rid of right now, because I fear that this is happening with people listening, that, and I hope it isn't, but I fear that there might be some misinterpretation that we say equal means good.
Yeah.
That's not the case.
No.
And we've already established that for something to be equal, that means a complete redistribution of balance. And so balance is an accommodation to an experience, and a collective experience in that it's a conglomerate of individual experience, while as equal is a leveling of experience, making it all the same.
Yeah.
And that inadvertently limits people. And I think that's what Robert Nozick was getting at with patterning. And I think that's what we're getting at with social theory.
Yeah. Well, and this is why, being very influenced by Nietzsche, I hate the terms good and bad.
Yes. Because,
well, I just pulled this out. There's this great quote by Oscar Wilde where he states, "It is absurd to divide people into good and bad. People are either charming or tedious."
Yeah.
It's like, yes, that's the case. And I'm currently writing a script for a YouTube video on gaming, but you begin to realize, to me, I really wonder if the use of good and bad is a way to elicit disgust.
Mm-hmm.
Because if I say something is good, well, then I'm naturally inclined to accept it. If I say it's bad, well, then it elicits disgust of, I don't want to have anything to do with what is bad. Yes, because of moral implications. But that's a fallacy, because I'm using it as a way to elicit a emotional response rather than actually delving into the argument. And what is so terrible about it is if I can get you to accept the emotion of disgust, you aren't going to ask them what they actually think, and you're not going to challenge me on what I think about them.
And how sad is it that we've normalized that? We've normalized the moral application of experience to good and bad.
Yeah.
And it's so primal in its dualism. And I don't want to get back into completely back into dualistic thought.
Yeah.
But it is. It's completely archaic and medieval in dualistic nature.
Yeah. Well, and that's because we've taken it to what is called a moral imperative degree, which is basically stating that it's something someone has to do, that to not do that would be a moral failure to do that. So the example I use in my script is, for instance, the gaming companies right now are saying that they have to raise the prices of video games, which is like, okay, well, that's a moral imperative. You're saying that if you didn't raise the prices, that would be a moral shortcoming. But it's a free market capitalist society. You don't have to raise the prices. You raise the prices based off of if you feel it is of that value, or if the market can take it, if they're willing to pay for it. It has nothing to do with morals at all.
I think it's drawing a turbid line between truth and good.
Yes.
And
which good is very much preference most of the time.
Right, and so is truth. And if both are preference and have relative qualities, then to justify truths in the plural sense, meaning that there can be multiple perspectives on something based upon morality, which we still hold culturally as structured. There is good and there is bad, and there's experiences in truth that sit within good and experiences in truth that sit within bad. But individually, we call out and we equate truths with good and bad.
Yeah.
That creates a convolution.
Yeah. It's interesting. I think you use the word truth a little more lenient than I do.
Yeah, probably.
Because I think of it, to give an example, if you think about a court system.
Yeah.
If I have several witnesses, it's not multiple truths. There is the event that happened with many different perspectives of that, which is what they know of the event, but it doesn't make their what they know true.
And not trying to swirl around my funny definition of truth. I think I compare experience and truth as a synonyms.
Okay. Very post-structuralist of you.
Well, and it is and it isn't, because on the offset it's very relative, but if there's more experiences that align, so take the court case for example.
Mm-hmm.
If 3 witnesses didn't see the guy rob the grocery store, but 10 did, and they were all there, then the truths, the experiences of the individuals who saw the man rob the grocery store, by outweighing the experiences and truths that of the people that didn't, there would be more basis and what we would both agree upon truth of the event, which is that the guy robbed the damn grocery store. And so I'm using truth within a relative sense to point towards truth in a concrete sense.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I find it very interesting to use it in a more loose way than me, because I would sit there and say, okay, well, based off of that same logic, that would mean the 3 that didn't say it, if they say he didn't do it, is also equally true.
Yeah, and that's why I make sure to preface when I say that some truths are more true than others. More alliance with the actual experience that happened. I'm not going to say that some weird, obscure experience isn't true because it's true for that individual.
Right. Well, that's where I would say it's their stories may align with the event that happened, which is true, but it doesn't mean that their experiences are true, especially since based on psychology, we know that they can reinterpret based off of information they're given what they experienced
and manipulate it into interpretations and stuff. No, I've purposefully phrased it that way for that reason in particular, because I set it up to get people that are post-structural to be like, yeah, and then I hit them with that.
Okay.
It's more true than some truths are more true than others.
Gotcha. Okay.
Kind of bringing it in, bringing the concept of relative truth into a context that might be more suitable for, any sort of order.
Right. Well, what's so interesting to me is you were kind of talking about the thing that creates this this community and this overarching narrative. And to me, as much as people kind of roll their eyes when his name gets brought up for it, it kind of seems like the only way to make this work is that thing that is true regardless of our experiences or thoughts toward it. It's just being accepted as self-evidently real.
Mm-hmm.
So again, like the example of the book, I don't want to get into any Descartes or Cartesian debate of, well, is the book real? Am I even real? And having to find something that's definitively true.
I think, therefore I am.
Yeah. To justify what is true. I would rather just sit there and say, okay, well, isn't it better from an Aristotelian view to just accept that this is real? But then also be willing to accept that it's also a real part of life that everyone thinks about it and perceives it differently.
Right. It's true, but there's also truths embedded in that truth.
Okay, yeah. I get you.
Yeah. And such a beautiful thing it is to have myth, to have story, to have experienced story through ritual, through ceremony, because that provides a basis from which subjective truths and collective truths come into contact and are synthesized often. There's a reason why, on a tribal level, using it within the context that we've discussed, and on a sociological level, that there have been so many archaic rites of passage for individuals to come into the fold of being a functioning cog in a society, because we needed to get on the same page.
Yeah.
If we didn't, there wouldn't be any order. There wouldn't be, if there's not a meta story, there's no story.
Right.
There's no story for you as an individual if you don't have a meta story. Going back into the belonging being a foundation for the individual to express themselves individually. Yeah. And so you need things like rites of passage, especially for people that are in prime stages of identity development, or people that are in healing, such as veterans, warriors that have exited the social sphere and are trying to come back in. There is a convolution of experience between what the social group has and what the developing adolescent has.
Yeah.
Because their truths aren't aligned yet.
Yeah.
And so it's through a transcendent story that's older than the culture, or older than the people in the culture, and has been around for all of them, that the individual is brought into the fold and everybody's on the same page.
Right.
And that's not a bad thing.
No, I agree. And that's something that makes me wonder if why modern music isn't doing so well, or any entertainment form for that matter, that so many isn't really hitting a mass audience,
right,
quote unquote, is because of the fact that it's not relatable through a shared narrative. And I'll use an artist, and I'm not saying this to say that this artist is bad, but I can't stand listening to AJR, if you know who that is.
Yeah.
I just have a really hard time listening to music that is constantly talking about the problems in their life. Does it mean that there is no one that can relate to that and doesn't share in that? No, but for a culture that is very obsessed with representing everyone, that kind of music doesn't represent everyone.
There's no mythos to it.
Correct. Whereas you think about the 80s, where an entire culture surrounded around this me generation movement, which is where a lot of our hyper-individualism stems from, you then start getting these mythical figures in hair metal that are living excess, and that's what the culture was unifying around, was this idea of living in excess pleasure, and it created a cultural narrative and cultural mentality and behavior, and archetypes to why people enjoyed the music so much. The thing that doesn't make sense to me is, why are kids today who never were a part of that culture going back and listening to all this music, though? Is there something about it that also hits true for today compared to a song from AJR just talking about, I've done all these great things, where's my karma for the future? It's just like, oh, geez, a freaking wheeze, man. Like, it just has no interest to me.
Yeah, it's funny. Looking at the retrospective aspect of culture, I think people in the 70s or 60s were looking back at the Roaring 20s. Like, there's this crazy interval of time that's consistent of the old becoming new again. And
feels like we're in the 70s right now.
Right, and maybe that's a part of a society growing. And a natural part of what conservatives actually want.
Yeah.
Because you're actually looking back onto what was good and you're trying to apply it to the current context to move into the future. Isn't that not what right-leaning politics, quote unquote, wants?
Right, but I don't even see that as just right-leaning, because right now, all the stuff on the left of protest, revolution, is very reminiscent of the university protests and all the street riots and protests of the 60s and 70s. And and a lot of them are championing that time as a model to be reflected on and used as a inspirational blueprint for today.
And maybe what I'm saying is that there's a retrospective nature to man beside your politics, and right-leaning politics tends to just base more of its opinions on it consciously. But as humans, we do it all the time. And maybe left-leaning politics just calls it new.
Maybe. I would say it's unconsciously, personally.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
I don't think they really have a choice.
Right.
I mean, I think, for instance, in gaming, the PS2 era was the best era in gaming, and that's the 2000s. Now, is that to say, as one person I had a conversation with, that there are no such thing as good games today? No, I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying, generally, there was way more games during the PS2 than there are now from AAA, AA, compared to indie developers. Does that mean that they were all good? No, a lot of those games were trash. But there was way more experimentation because of the limits of the technology, and there wasn't as many hands in on it because of money.
Yeah.
Compared to today, where almost every studio is being asked to make a live service game to return maximum investment as possible, a cash cow. But again, I'm not saying that because today's gaming has nothing to offer. It's an understanding that this is this thing that made this generation of technology for gaming great,
right,
compared to today, which is what I would say people want, is something like that to come back. But that's looking back for something as hopes in the future.
But that seems integrated. That seems like you're integrating what
yeah.
you've experienced into presently trying to aspire for something into the future.
Well, yeah, because I don't want us to go back.
Right.
We can't go back.
And I've realized, I was talking to somebody today about this actually, that I'm probably the youngest you can be to have something to look back on. You need to live a little bit before you can actually look back on something.
Yeah.
And doing that for the first time in my life is interesting. But I wonder how much a society has to live for it to look back on something. And we obviously do it. We obviously are looking and idolizing, but it's not the same. What we perceive it, and this goes back into a Foucaultian sense, is what we perceive as the 70s is not the 70s.
Correct.
And so it's our distorted perception of what has happened in a dissonance with our contemporary experience.
Correct. Well, and that's why it always confuses me when Gen X or boomers or even my generation, millennials, sit there and go, well, back in my day, this is how things were done, and this is just the way we think. And you're just like, you don't think that way now, though. You are living in this context with this culture, with the language, with the entertainment, with the influence that it has. Mm-hmm. You still think about it the same way as is culturally being thought about.
Yeah, and you know, this is an Eastern thought that I urge people to hold for a second. That both the past and the future exist through you in the present.
Correct. Well, and see, that's my biggest problem with the way our political system works, is you have those that are typically on the right that are the loudest looking back, mm-hmm. and those on the left looking forward, but none of them want to stop and actually ask, okay, what about now?
Right.
The left is always saying about what the world could be, but they never actually want to look at how the world is to figure out whether or not that's attainable. Again, it's just like the whole using the EQ analogy for homelessness on, okay, well, you want to attain helping all homeless people get out of addictions and integrating it back into society. But with the way the world is, not all of them want to be.
Well, and I think that there's something about the present that doesn't work with our dualistic natures that we've contemporarily expressed, because it's encapsulating of and rather than or. You know, that if anybody has experienced any form of psychosomatic presence in the moment, not convoluted with thought, one realizes that it's not necessarily about what it is or isn't, but what it is. You know, it not being a thing where the opposite legitimizes itself, but the whole dang thing, the whole story.
The gestalt.
Yes, where everything belongs. And so I think maybe, you know, talking about the disorder that you have brought up a few times, I think it's maybe a lack of a willingness to sit presently within the current moment, and it's perpetuated, and a byproduct of it is the hyper-dualistic natures that we find ourselves in, without diving too much into dualism.
Yeah. Well, and again, it seems to be related to what generally, not saying specifically, generally both sides want. Mm-hmm. They are not wanting the same thing, but they're also wanting the same thing. Yes. It's just how they want to get there that's really different. But they're going on about shoulds rather than what it is. Mm-hmm. They're going on about prescriptivisms rather than descriptivism. Mm-hmm. And I don't see how you could... Again, this is why I have a hard time calling people conservatives. I don't see how you can call yourself a conservative and not pay attention to how things are, to then be able to go back and grab the things that work and restore them, or make new things for that future. Because the thing that really strikes me as odd is a lot of people tend to act generally as if we stick to conservatism, all problems in the future will be solved. It's bullshit. But progressive liberals to socialists also act as if we went down socialism or progressive liberalism, it would solve all issues for the future. Bullshit. Like, if that was the case, then we should just get rid of our system now, because this system should have just worked for all time. But again, if you read most of the founding fathers and philosophers on the founding of this country, they're not talking about it as if what they set is going to be the same 100 years from when it was founded. They're acknowledging it's not going to be the same, and each generation is going to have to face something that is an issue to solve for themselves. But I don't know, back to our previous conversations, it just feels utopian.
Yeah.
Very utopian.
Structural.
Yeah.
And I really love your description of it being prescriptive and not descriptive. I think that's a beautiful way to put it. On an individual level and a social level, what we do is we prescribe what it ought to be or what it could be rather than what it is. And maybe, connecting a lack of duality in the present moment, our contemporary and social understanding of that notion might represent itself as hyperrelativity. We've come to understand that it isn't either or, it isn't good or bad in a social sense, and then you have that the post-structuralists coming in with the hyperrelativity of truth, and maybe that in and of itself is a bastardizing draw towards what is the mystery of the now, trying to express itself, but it's incomplete. For some reason that I don't know yet. I haven't been able to put that together yet. Why it is incomplete? Maybe because it lacks the grounding of structure to allow it to express its relativity.
Yes. Well, and this goes back to our first episode, which is the irony here that you're pointing out is people are trying to find certainty in relativism.
Yeah. And, I say that again, that the hyperrelativity of post-structuralism is incomplete because it lacks a belonging in structuralism, just as we individually aspire for individualistic freedom, but you cannot have that if you do not have a social belonging to sit as a foundation. We're just seeing the social translation of that notion.
Yes. Yeah. And for fear of us going in circles now and beating a dead horse, I think it really goes back to what you were talking about before of, it's very Jordan Peterson in many ways, of putting things in the right place. Because a phrase that I always find ironically hilarious is the whole, I don't care what people do, but they should do it the right way. And you sit there and you think, well, yeah, but that is relative.
Right.
For instance, if making sure that I have food on the table is the right thing to do, and healthy food is the best thing to do when it comes to my quality of life, if I only make $20,000 a year, that healthy food may be out of my budget. Therefore, I should not purchase all that at the expense of losing the ability to even put something on the table. I should work within my means. If I have $50,000 a year, I may be able to swing it part of the time and not all of the time. so I do the best I can. It's all within the means
Mm-hmm.
you have. And for me, and I think that's where you and I agree with this a lot, and it seems to be a part of our philosophical worldview, is that, yeah, there are better ways of doing things.
Mm-hmm.
There's the structure, but not everybody can do that.
Mm-hmm.
So it depends on the context, which makes it relative.
Mm-hmm. And it's a balance between the two. I ask the people listening to this, what are the stories that you live by? And are they foundations or are they chasms?
Yeah.
Because that's the balance that we're trying to strike here. Is the structure that you're trying to and do live by, is that structure supportive of the relative experience that you're inevitably cast into, or is that structure a abysmal endless hole for your relativism to lose itself in existential quality?
Yes.
And so you become completely hyper relative,
Yes.
lack of social structure, lack of story that you share with one another, and so your experience becomes isolated in its events.
Yes. Yeah. Well, and again, to point out the disorder I see that needs to be healed and addressed is, and why I said I just don't see any overarching narrative to the degree that we think of narratives that are communal and sharing. The right, well, let me start with the left side of the horseshoe, so progressive liberals to socialists. They are creating narratives of what could be. Which means people are having to share what could be, not what is. Which means they have nothing to share. They have a potential goal, but no one knows if that goal is attainable. It's never been done before, which isn't totally true. It has been done. They just don't always want to look at that. My problem with the right is they're looking back to things that have happened, but they also seem to be creating narratives out of the past for something that never happened.
Yeah.
And I'm probably being a bit too hyperbolic and extreme when I say never happened.
Yeah.
But I guess to be more specific, they tend to distort what happened to create a narrative of what things should be.
And not actually looking at it with a clear reference.
Correct. So it means both sides are doing something similar, but looking in different directions.
And I want to join my question that I've asked the audience with another one which pertains to this in the individuality in contrast to the structure. Who do you share your story with? I'm not saying like the story of who you are, or well, I do mean that your story, your experience. Who shares that? Because if nobody, then that is a existential relativity that I don't wish upon my worst enemy.
Right, but I would say the problem that we're facing now is a group relative problem,
Yes.
not just a... I do think that there is because of the hyper-individualism wherein there is an issue, it would be interesting to see if there's any evidence on this. I do think that there is an issue of it being that kind of existential problem, that it's so individual, of no shared experience for a narrative with. But on the social scale of where we are politically, I would say that is due to a group problem.
Well, and I asked that
narrative.
question because if the narrative is that we're all different, if the narrative is that we are all individualistic, then what I say still holds truth, that if you share your truth with nobody, if you share your experience with nobody, if nobody has any convergence with your experience because you're living in a collective narrative that means that prescribes different experience and relativity within that narrative of relativity, then that is an existential chasm that I don't wish upon anyone, because it means
Right.
that nothing that you live or experience has any validity to test upon.
Yeah.
And everything becomes disorienting and liminal.
Yeah. Well, and that's why John Vervaeke's whole work is about direction.
Right.
It's not about purpose. Purpose is so fleeting. He said in a, I think I sent it to you, it was that really long, like 3-hour long podcast. He was talking about purpose is just so fleeting, because when you make into metaphor your purpose of getting to the top of a mountain, you tend to get to the top of mountains before the end of your life.
Yeah.
So you can't really call something your life's purpose when you get to the top of that mountain, you go, well, geez, what do I do now? Like, what I thought was going to be so fulfilling, I wouldn't need to do anything else in my life, hasn't done that. What do I do? Which is where he says it's about orienting yourself in the best possible direction. That way you can keep developing and doing things to the best of your ability.
And if we're talking about longevity of meaning in one's life, I think the best way to do it is to have a meaning that's shared with a group. Because that, like I said earlier in this discussion, the group lives longer than you.
Yeah.
So if you want meaning till the day you die and past that, in your memory, ask yourself if the meaning that you prescribe to your life is congruent with meanings that are shared by others within your community.
Yeah.
Because if it isn't, that same existential individuality exists and is abysmal to me.
Yes. Well, and that's why I said I think I said it in previous podcasts, the Foucaultian idea in Voltaire of saying, stop worrying about the battle between the gods. This whole idea of the worldview for the U.S. between New York and California versus Texas and Florida, it's so short-sighted, so ridiculous. It's going to get us nowhere. That is a battle between the gods. What happens in Florida should not concern Colorado, Montana, Washington. When you think about all the different counties within a state and the different issues that they face, why should it all be treated as one? So to your point, I think the best thing with that phrase, as someone put it, I believe it, the YouTube channel was The Living Philosophy, said, stop worrying about the battle between the gods and go tend to your garden, which is go tend to the things that are actually within your control, within your own perception, your own community, the people you deal with. That is the best way to create things. I can't tell you how much it drives me nuts when I hear bands go on tour that are fully political, anti-establishment, and then say, we're here to create a community for everybody. And you sit there and you go, so what do you guys do when the show's over? What community is there?
Right.
Because I don't meet up with you guys after the show's done. You don't meet up with me. We don't go and do things together. We don't share any narratives on what is important to us. We just all say, we team, we narrative, we group, we community. It's very caveman.
Yeah. And so go tend to your garden and live a story that others are living and live it with them. Because what better way to prescribe meaning? And if you don't know how to do that, look how people have done it for the majority of human existence.
Yeah. Don't worry about other people's lives. Otherwise, yours is going to pass you by.
Right. And if you're going to worry about other people's lives, worry about how you can share it with them, not how they oppose your own.
Just don't be a pariah off of somebody's orientation. Sorry. So, but yeah, no, I don't think I can say that
I think we're
any better. So
I think that's a great place.
Very cool.
I think it should